Your car starts fine every morning, and when cold, it runs without issues. But the moment it warms up, something changes. The temperature needle starts creeping, coolant disappears overnight without any visible leak, and there is a faint, sweet smell from the exhaust you cannot quite place. So you take it to a shop, and they run the head gasket test, the one with the blue fluid, and the result comes back clean. The mechanic looks you in the eye and tells you everything is fine. But here is what most mechanics will never tell you. That test can come back completely negative while the gasket is destroyed on the inside. One Land Cruiser owner trusted that exact result, and what happened to him later in this video will change how you think about head gasket diagnostics. Your head gasket seals three systems from each other: combustion, coolant, and oil. When it fails, it punches a hole between systems that were never supposed to touch. There are 7 different ways it can fail, and each one produces different symptoms. I am going to show you the 8 signs your engine gives you when it happens, the tests that actually catch it, the one kitchen item that exposes a blown gasket in 15 seconds flat, and whether the cheap sealer fix everyone talks about actually works or destroys your engine. Now the signs, there are 8 of them, and each one tells a different part of the story. Sign 8 is the spark plug fingerprint, and this is one of the simplest checks because it tells you more than most people realize. Pull all the plugs out and lay them side by side, and what you are looking for is one plug that looks completely different from the others. White chalky residue means coolant has been burning in that cylinder, and a plug that looks steam cleaned means coolant was blasting away the carbon like a pressure washer. You might also see black tarry deposits depending on how long the leak has been going on, but one mismatched plug tells you exactly which cylinder is leaking, and that matters for every sign that comes next. Sign 7 is the misfire, and this happens when coolant finds its way into a cylinder and interferes with combustion. The detail that matters most is whether the misfire is isolated to one specific cylinder, because if it is, that points at a gasket breach rather than general engine wear. A Honda Civic owner had a pending misfire code on cylinder 3, and the engine ran fine during normal driving. But that code said something was interfering with combustion in that one cylinder and nothing else. Honda has a particular weakness here because the open deck design gives very little gasket surface area for the seal to grip onto. For many Honda owners, an engine swap turns out smarter than a gasket repair, and a Civic replacement engine costs about $350 with a warranty. But misfires are not the only thing that happens when coolant invades a cylinder. Sign 6 is the rough cold start, and the Ford Escape owner described it perfectly. On startup, the engine sputters and shakes for a minute or two, then smooths out like nothing happened. The reason is fascinating. Metal expands when it gets hot, so when the engine is cold, a tiny gap in the gasket stays open just enough for coolant to seep through overnight and pool in the cylinder. On startup, the engine fights through that puddle, but as it heats up, the metal expands, the breach seals itself, and everything runs normally. This drives people crazy, because by the time you reach the mechanic, the car runs perfectly, and there is nothing to find. The EcoBoost family from Ford has a design flaw that makes this pattern especially common, because a slit between the cylinders in the block speeds up coolant intrusion. Ford actually recommends full long block replacement rather than just a gasket job on these engines. The symptoms match exactly: a misfire on one cylinder, choppy idle on cold start, and coolant loss from full to minimum in about a week. A class action lawsuit exists over this design, but tens of thousands of these engines run fine, and people with failures post online while people with working cars do not. Now flip that scenario completely. Sign 5 is the exact reverse, the hard, hot start. When the engine is warm, the cooling system is pressurized, and that pressure pushes coolant into the cylinder while the engine sits turned off. The Honda Civic owner reported exactly this, where cold starts were fine, but hot starts after an hour or two were terrible, with the RPM bogging down and the cabin shaking. The next sign is far sneakier because it builds so slowly you might convince yourself it is normal. Sign 4 is overheating that refuses to go away. The Saab 92X owner had 4 mild overheating events over 2 years. The needle climbed past 3/4 but never hit the red, and it happened mostly at idle. Driving or turning on the heater brought it right back down, and that pattern is a small gasket leak because combustion gases sneak into the cooling system and create air pockets that block coolant flow. The Saab 92X is really a Subaru Impreza underneath with an EJ25 engine, and at 160,000 miles gasket failure on these cars is basically expected. The most common leak is the driver's side rear corner, and the fix is machining the heads and using multi-layer steel gaskets. Now before you assume it is the gasket, know this: a sticking thermostat causes intermittent overheating that mimics a gasket problem perfectly. Get the factory thermostat with the pinhole that lets air through, because aftermarket ones without it trap air and create symptoms that never go away. The radiator cap is another culprit, because if the center disc is floppy, the cap cannot hold pressure, causing coolant loss and overheating from a part that costs almost nothing. Many owners spent hundreds on diagnostics before discovering a $5 cap was the entire problem. A Dodge Journey had a complete gasket repair done and still ran hot because the real problem was trapped air left behind during the repair, and bleeding the system properly fixed it. If you have replaced the thermostat, the cap, flushed the system, bled the air, and the engine still overheats, suspect the gasket strongly. Trust your instinct because you are not imagining it. But if it is the gasket, always ask what caused the failure. A Mini Cooper owner found that a slow water pump leak burned out the fan, and with no fan, the engine overheated and cracked the head. Replace the gasket without finding the root cause, and you will do the job twice. And the hidden cause that destroys more gaskets than anything else, I will show you right after sign 1. Those were the signs you can feel or find through diagnostics. The last 3 leave visible evidence that gets harder to ignore. Sign 3 is white smoke from the exhaust, the one most people think they understand, and that overconfidence is why so many get it wrong. Exhaust smoke tells different stories depending on color. Blue smoke means oil burning where it should not. Black smoke means the engine is running too rich, and white smoke with a sweet smell means antifreeze burning off as it passes through the combustion chamber. Not all white smoke is equal, though. A brief puff on a cold morning is just condensation burning off, and it disappears in a minute or two. But what matters is strong, persistent white smoke with that sweet antifreeze smell that stays no matter how long the engine runs. What almost nobody realizes is that white smoke only appears with large leaks, and a small leak may produce no visible smoke at all. The Ford Escape owner had just a slight cold start puff that was barely visible, and that tiny puff was the only clue. As I showed you with signs 6 and 5, plenty of gaskets leak without any visible smoke, so never use the absence of smoke as your green light. One Land Cruiser owner had white smoke pouring out everywhere, and it seemed like a textbook blown gasket, but a compression test showed all cylinders healthy, and the real problem was a seized alternator that had stopped the water pump. Smoke is always a clue, but never a verdict on its own. The next sign catches leaks too small to see. Sign 2 is coolant disappearing without a visible leak. A Subaru Outback owner noticed coolant vanishing overnight, but only after aggressive driving above 3,000 RPM, and on gentle days the level stayed full, meaning the leak was load dependent. A RAV4 owner was refilling every single day, and EcoBoost Mustang owners saw levels drop from full to minimum within a week. If you hear bubbling or gurgling from the reservoir after shutdown, that is exhaust gas trapped in the cooling system, and constant bubbles when the engine is stone cold confirms it. Here's a free check you can do tonight. Let the car cool overnight, squeeze the top radiator hose in the morning, and it should be soft. If it feels firm after sitting cold all night, gas is building up in the system. Then pop the radiator cap and smell inside, because exhaust fumes from the coolant means a gasket problem. Now a test that costs nothing and takes 15 seconds. Cold engine, radiator cap off, stretch plastic wrap across the filler neck with a small dip in the center, hold it with a rubber band, and start the engine for 15 seconds. If the plastic pops upward, combustion gas is entering the cooling system. Even a tiny leak shows up because it only takes a teaspoon of gas volume to push the plastic. For professional confirmation, mechanics use the leak down test. It forces air through the leak under pressure instead of waiting for gas to leak on its own, which makes it far more sensitive than the block test. The cooling system pressure test pressurizes the system and lets it sit, and if a leak exists, coolant gets pushed into the combustion chamber. You check with a bore scope, a tiny camera, through the spark plug hole, and coolant on the cylinder walls is absolute proof. This test also tells you whether the problem is the gasket, a cracked head, or a cracked block. But before you assume any of these tests mean you need a gasket, know that other problems can mimic the same symptoms. The heater core can fake a gasket failure too. A Chevy Sonic owner had a heater that stopped working, and the shop said blown gasket, but coolant stayed stable after a top off. A real gasket leak keeps losing coolant continuously, and old coolant can look terrifying without meaning anything at all. A Miata that sat 8 months had brown rusty coolant but no milky oil, no smoke, and no overheating. It was just old coolant that needed a flush. Disappearing coolant tells you something is leaking, and the final sign tells you where it went. Sign 1, the most serious of all. Chocolate milk in the oil. Pull the dipstick and look carefully. It should be one consistent color with no froth, no foam, and no milky streaks. Then check the underside of the oil filler cap, because whitish buildup means coolant is getting into the crankcase. Watch out for the trap though, because white froth under the cap can be condensation in cold climates. Condensation goes away after a 30-minute highway drive, while true coolant contamination does not. Real coolant makes all the oil milky throughout, not just the cap, while condensation only shows up at the cap itself. Also, watch the oil level, because if it rises without anyone adding oil, that is coolant seeping into the oil pan. A Subaru owner saw oil seeping and suspected the gasket, but the real leak was the oil pan, found with UV dye and a black light. Check valve cover gaskets and spark plug tube seals first, because they fail far more often. One thing catches people off guard. The Northstar engine almost never puts water in the oil when the gasket fails, and some Toyota engines behave the same way. Even with a completely blown gasket, the oil can look completely normal, meaning clean oil proves nothing. If you see the chocolate milk, your gasket has failed in the deadliest direction. Coolant in the oil destroys lubrication, the bearings grind against the crankshaft, and the engine can seize in as little as 10 to 40 miles. That is not theoretical, that is mechanical certainty. This is called hydrolocking, and it happens when a cylinder fills with coolant overnight. The piston tries to compress that liquid, but liquids do not compress, so the connecting rod bends or snaps, causing catastrophic damage in an instant. That is why getting a tow matters. A tow costs $100 to $200 while engine replacement costs thousands. Yet drivers routinely gamble the thousands to save the hundreds. Can you actually drive with a blown gasket? If coolant is burning off as white smoke, that is survivable short term if you keep refilling. But if coolant is in the oil, remember the chocolate milk. Do not drive. The biggest mistake people make is driving anyway, because a diagnostic test gave them false confidence. Remember the Land Cruiser owner from the start of this video? He ran the block test, and the result came back negative. The fluid stayed blue, which to any mechanic means the engine is clean. So he kept driving and told his family everything was fine. 30 miles later, the engine failed catastrophically, and when they tore it apart, they found a blown gasket on cylinder 6. That owner is not alone. A Honda Civic, a Cadillac DeVille with the Northstar, and a Ford Escape all had confirmed blown gaskets, and everyone passed the block test. The block test draws air from the radiator through a chemical liquid, and if exhaust gases leak into the cooling system, the liquid changes color, but it only looks in one direction, checking whether exhaust gas is pushing into the coolant, and none of the other failure modes turn the test fluid yellow. The test that catches what everything else misses is the oil analysis. A Jeep Cherokee owner with 250,000 miles replaced the entire cooling system. 2 compression tests showed all 6 cylinders perfect. 2 combustion gas tests came back negative. No coolant in the oil and no white smoke. Every test said this engine was healthy, and it was still overheating. Then he sent an oil sample to Blackstone Lab, and the analysis found coolant hiding in the oil at levels too small to see on a dipstick. Every standard test missed it, and a $30 oil analysis caught it. Now the question I teased earlier, the one that causes the most financial trouble. Can a sealer actually fix a blown head gasket? Mechanics say extreme caution, because these products clog the radiator, heater core, and water pump. The active ingredient is sodium silicate, liquid glass, the same compound the government used in cash for clunkers to permanently destroy engines. Only a coolant to combustion chamber leak has any chance of being sealed, because the product needs combustion heat to activate. If the car runs 15 to 20 minutes without overheating, a sealer might work, but if it overheats faster, the leak is too big. The ideal candidate is something like a Duratec 2.3 with a pinhole leak, half a millimeter of coolant loss per week, no overheating, and no smoke. That micro leak is what sealers were designed for, and anything bigger is a gamble. A 4Runner owner got 40,000 miles from Blue Devil, and a Honda Pilot at 340,000 miles was still running 10,000 miles later. Steel Seal had the most transparent test, where a 30-year technician used it on his own Land Cruiser, and within 24 hours, the white smoke stopped. But every success is described the same way. Temporary, never a reliable long-term fix. If you do use one, bypass the heater core first, so the product does not clog it. Run the engine for 50 minutes to let the sealant cure, then flush the entire cooling system afterward. Skipping that flush is how cooling systems get permanently clogged. A sealer makes sense when a 1999 Camry worth $2,500 needs $1,500 in repairs, buying you 6 to 12 months to find a replacement. Using one on a car you plan to keep is how a $1,500 repair becomes an engine replacement. The only permanent fix is a quality multi-layer steel gasket, and professional repair runs $1,200 to $1,600. For high-mileage cars, a junkyard engine under 800 or a JDM long block can beat a gasket job. But none of that matters if you replace the gasket without understanding what killed it. This brings us to the hidden cause I promised you. Why did the gasket fail in the first place? And what if the gasket was just the victim? The gasket acts like a fuse, blowing to protect more expensive parts. The biggest hidden cause is detonation, where shock waves pound through the combustion chamber at supersonic speed and hammer the gasket harder than it was built to take. Replace the gasket but ignore the detonation, and you will blow the new one too, because the gasket is the symptom, and detonation is the disease. In a Rover V8, the gasket was nibbled from the outside edge toward the fire ring, and in a Mopar Stroker, multiple cylinders showed oval, deformed fire rings, the classic detonation pattern. A 3S GTE running 20 pounds of boost on 91 octane, and the community called it a recipe for disaster. Most people have never heard of squish clearance, the tiny gap between piston and cylinder head. The 3S GTE had about 73 thousandths of an inch, way too large, and that oversized gap helped cause the detonation that killed the gasket. The Toyota 1FZFE is another engine famous for gasket failure, but not from detonation. Toyota stopped using asbestos around 1990, and the early replacement materials were inferior, though the redesign eventually fixed it. Other engines fail because of aftermarket modifications. The 6-liter Power-Stroke diesel has one of the most famous failure histories in this category. Tuning chips push boost beyond what factory bolts can hold. The bolts stretch permanently, and as clamping force fades, the gasket fails. Towing with a tuned truck is especially dangerous, and a constant coolant purge actually points at the EGR cooler, not the gasket. The fix is stronger ARP head studs, but they can void the warranty. Watch out for fake ARP bolts and Felpro gaskets sold online because they do not meet specs. Always buy from reputable dealers. So, the fact is that you cannot predict gasket failure because it is binary, the gasket seals, or it does not, and it does not wear down gradually the way brake pads do. If a mechanic tells you your head gasket is about to blow, be skeptical because one owner was told exactly that, and a second opinion confirmed it was perfectly fine. If you suspect a blown gasket, follow this exact process. Confirm the problem with real testing and not just a single test, and identify the leak type because the direction decides whether a sealer can even work. But the best repair is the one you never need in the first place. Check coolant regularly, change it on schedule, and shut the engine off the moment the temperature climbs. Responding fast to overheating is what prevents the warping that kills gaskets in the first place. Here is what matters. If your spark plugs do not match, if one cylinder misfires, if cold starts are rough but the engine smooths out warm, if the gauge keeps climbing, if you smell something sweet in the exhaust, if coolant vanishes with no puddle, or if your oil looks like chocolate milk, do not ignore it. Any one of those is worth investigating, and 2 or 3 together means you are almost certainly looking at a blown head gasket. If the block test comes back negative but the symptoms are still there, keep investigating. You now know more about blown head gaskets than most car owners will ever learn, but your gasket is only as strong as the cooling system protecting it. If you want to know the exact steps to make your car's cooling system last twice as long so you never have to deal with a blown gasket, click the video on your screen right now. I will see you there.